this is going to be our last new lesson before spring break. So I think what I'm going to do is within the next day or so, we'll have a quiz over the dividing polynomials and greatest common factor. And then we'll pick up after spring break with actually factoring a polynomial, which there's a reason we're going to wait until after spring break. I don't want to start that and then you guys have a week off school and then us come back to it. So what we're going to do is take this idea of greatest common factor and kind of look at a polynomial with that and see what we can do. Excuse me. So before we start talking about factoring, I want to just take a second and just remind you guys what happens here when you distribute a monomial into a polynomial. So I'm going to multiply everything on the inside of this polynomial by 5m. So when I multiply, 5 times 3 is 15, and then, sorry about that, and then what happens to the variables here? I've got an m to the second on the inside. I'm multiplying it by another m from the outside. So this is going to become m to the third power. Okay, so it's using that exponent rule. When you multiply variables, your exponents, you just add them together. So 2 plus 1, that's why that's a 3. Then I'm going to take that 5m times 4m. So 5 times 4 is 20. M times m is going to give us an m squared. And then the last term will be 10m. So what I'm asking you guys to do today is basically take this finished product polynomial and divide out the common factor and put it in front of the parentheses. So we're basically doing this backwards. I'm going to give you the bottom and you're going to create the top. Excuse me. So what you're looking for, you kind of have to look at these in two different fashions here. You've got to look at the variables and the numbers. So this one right here, you might be able to look at it pretty quickly and determine, oh, I can divide a 6 out of everything. That's great. Now remember, greatest common factor, I want the biggest. So if you see that all of these are divisible by 3, that's great. Always look for something bigger. So we're going to take the biggest number out of this. These guys are all divisible by 6. So when I divide these by 6, you might be able to pretty easily determine, that's 2, 1, and 1. But the exponents, the variables are going to be not the harder part, but the part that you really have to pay attention to, because all of these variables terms have a certain number of x's in common. Okay, so I need to figure out how many x's I can divide out of each term without going over the number of x's that are in a term. So like I can't divide an x to the 7th out of an x to the 5th because there aren't enough x's there to divide out. What you wind up doing is focusing on the smallest term, because I can divide an x to the 5th out of here and just take all of them. I can divide an x to the 5th out of here and I'd have 1 left over. I can divide an x to the 5th out of here and have 2 left over. So when you're looking at your common factor, you're always going to be able to divide out the smallest exponent. Okay? So basically all of these terms here are going to get divided by 6x to the 5th, 6x to the 5th, 6x to the 5th. So that's going to leave 2x squared. I still have my x to the 7th if I multiply it back together, plus 1x. Still have x to the 6th if I multiply it back together. And then my last term, 6x to the 5th, I divided out 6x to the 5th. So you are dividing. So like think back to when you first started doing division way back in grade school. You took a number and you divided it by itself. The result is 1. You're dividing, so you're not going to wind up with any zeros on these when you're dividing. The smallest it's going to get is 1. Okay, so everything is still there. I just kind of pulled it apart. Last unit we put everything together. Now we're going to kind of start pulling it back apart and seeing what made it up. Okay, 15, 30, 35. Figure out the greatest common factor for your coefficients. On this one, it's 5. And then an n to the third, an n to the second, and then a single n. Again, the smallest one is what you're going to be able to factor out. You take anything bigger than a single n out, and you won't be able to divide it out of that last term. So that's going to leave me 3n squared, a minus 6n, and a 7. All of your variables in the parentheses went down by 1 because I divided a single n out at the beginning. These don't get any harder as far as the exponents and the variables go. The hard part on this, I think, is going to be recognizing the greatest common factor for your coefficients. Okay, 42, 28, 28. I'm going to do this one wrong at first because I want to show you guys something. So I know that 42, 28, 28 are all divisible by 14. That's the greatest number that I can divide out of these. However, you may not see that, and you're like, oh, well, I'm going to divide all these guys by 7. So what I'm going to show you, well, it isn't correct. You can take it a step further. That way you haven't wasted your work. So let's say I divide all these guys by 7a squared. Sorry, 7a squared. That's going to leave me a 6a squared minus 4a minus 4. Well, I know going into this that I kind of screwed it up. I didn't take out the greatest common factor. If you notice, 6, 4, and 4 are all divisible by 2. So if you're doing one of these and you just kind of look over your polynomial and you're like, oh, I didn't take out the biggest thing, you can still divide that 2 out. So I'm going to divide all these guys by 2, which is going to leave me a 3a squared, a minus 2a, and a minus 2. Well, that 2 that I just divided out, what am I going to do with it? Well, I can multiply that back on to the 7. Right? I said when we started that this is divisible by 14 to begin with, but if you don't take out the greatest common factor, that doesn't mean that you're wrong and that you've wasted your time. It just means you might have to do the greatest common factor again. Okay? But then if you do that, if you have to take out multiple common factors, just multiply them all together at the end and you will create the greatest common factor out front. Okay?